Hi all, in today's section we will be handling about Raspberry Pi. So basically Raspberry Pi was with Python. So first myself Ajin Roch and Mr Pranav will be handling with my Raspberry Pi and then move on to Python coding.
So now we see what a Raspberry Pi is.
In this video, we will be seeing about the complete walkthrough of Raspberry Pi, the various features and versions of Raspberry Pi, and what are the differences between Arduino and a Raspberry Pi, software and elements required for a Raspberry Pi, and how to set up Raspberry Pi with a live demonstration.
The Raspberry Pi is a series of small single-board computers developed in the United Kingdom by Raspberry Pi Foundation in association with Broadcom. It is a very affordable mini computer which is used by enthusiasts and industry specialists for developing their projects.
Now, let us see some differences between a traditional desktop PC and a Raspberry Pi. A traditional PC have replaceable or upgradable parts like CPU, RAM, hard disk, cooling system, a discrete graphics, motherboard, etc. Whereas a Raspberry Pi is a system-on-chip based device where all of these components are integrated on a single circuit board.
Also, a notable difference is that a traditional PC cannot be used for an IoT application due to its size and a lot of movable parts.
Hence, the solution for this challenge is the Raspberry Pi, a credit card sized computing board that plays a major role in the field of IoT. So, here are some features of the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi runs on a 1.5 GHz 64-bit quad-core ARM Cortex A72 CPU, and it also has a various RAM configurations of 1GB, 2GB or 4GB LPDDR4. It also supports onboard Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 5.0. It has two USB 3.0 ports, two USB 2.0 ports. It also supports Gigabit Ethernet. It has 40 GPIO header pins, 2 micro HDMI ports which can support 4K up to 60 FPS, and it runs on OpenGL ES 3.0 graphics. It has a combined headphone jack, and it also has CSI camera port, DSI display port and micro SD card slot through which the OS will be running, and USB-C power supply.
Here we look into the different versions of the Raspberry Pi. The first Raspberry Pi, which was released in the year 2012, was the Raspberry Pi 1 Model B, which had a single core CPU and 512 megabits of RAM. And it is also notable that it had just 26 GPIO pins. Later, in 2013, the Raspberry Pi Foundation released its next model, the Raspberry Pi 1 Model A, which had a slighter improvement than the previous version. In the year 2014, Raspberry Pi released its next version of the Raspberry Pi 1, which was the Raspberry Pi 1 Model B+. Here, they removed the analog and video output and replaced it with 40 GPIO pins with a HDMI which can support up to 1080 pixels, and also it had 4 USB ports. Then came the Raspberry Pi 1 Model A+, which was a smaller version of the Raspberry Pi 1. It had 40 GPIO pins but did not have a RJ45 Ethernet port and just had one USB port. In the same year, the Raspberry Pi also released its first compute module, that is the Raspberry Pi 1 compute module. This was extensively used in the industrial applications. In the year 2015, the Raspberry Pi Foundation released their second versions of their board, the Raspberry Pi 2 Model B. This version had a 900 MHz quad-core CPU with 1 GB of RAM. Immediately in the next year, Raspberry Pi Foundation released their next version of their board, that is the Raspberry Pi 3 Model B, in the year 2016. This board ran on a 1.2 GHz quad-core CPU with 1 GB of RAM, and also it had inbuilt Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. In the year 2017, the Raspberry Pi Foundation introduced its second version of its computing module, which was called the Raspberry Pi Compute Module 3. Then, in 2018, it launched the Raspberry Pi 3 Model B+. This model ran on a 1.4 GHz 64-bit ARM Cortex A53 processor with 1 GB of RAM. It also had a dual band Wi-Fi and a gigabit Ethernet over USB 2.0. In the same year, Raspberry Pi also launched the Raspberry Pi 3 Model A+, which looked similar to the Raspberry Pi 1 Model A+. This model had the same features which a Raspberry Pi 3 Model B+ had, whereas it was lacking a Ethernet port and just had one USB port. In the year 2019, Raspberry Pi Foundation released its 4th edition of the Raspberry Pi board, which was the Raspberry Pi 4 Model B. This board runs on a Cortex A72 64-bit quad-core CPU at 1.5 GHz. It has a various number of RAM configuration of 1GB, 2GB and 4GB. Later, in 2020, it was further upgraded to 8GB RAM. Also, a notable point is that the power supply has changed to Type-C, and instead of one HDMI port, it has given dual micro HDMI ports which will support up to 4K resolutions. In the same year, Raspberry Pi Foundation also released the Compute Module 3+. The Raspberry Pi Foundation also introduced various smaller versions of the Raspberry Pi, which is also known as the smallest and the cheapest version of Raspberry Pi, which is the Raspberry Pi Zero. There are 3 models of the Raspberry Pi Zero, which was first introduced in 2015, then later in 2017 and in 2018. The Raspberry Pi Zero runs on a single core 1 GHz CPU with 512 megabits of RAM. It also has inbuilt Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, along with the 40 GPIO pins. Here are a few differences between a Raspberry Pi and an Arduino. A Raspberry Pi is a microprocessor, whereas an Arduino is a microcontroller. Hence, we can get higher performance and stability in a Raspberry Pi, whereas an Arduino board may get a lesser performance and may get easily damaged. Since a Raspberry Pi is a computer device, we can easily connect it to the internet, whereas an Arduino requires external hardware to connect to the internet. A Raspberry Pi can be programmed using Python, Ruby, C, C++ and also Java, whereas an Arduino is a bootloader based device, hence can be programmed only with a specialized package called the Arduino. Here's the representation of the GPIO pins of a Raspberry Pi. The GPIO pin stands for the General Purpose Input or Output pins. It is a standard interface used with the Raspberry Pi to connect with the other electronic devices. For example, the sensors, the diodes, the displays and other system-on-chip modules. There are a total of 40 GPIO pins in the Raspberry Pi board. Now let's look at the different softwares and elements required for a Raspberry Pi. The Secure Shell. The Secure Shell is a cryptographic network protocol for operating network services securely over an unsecured network. We use the Secure Shell for logging into our Raspberry Pi remotely to any other computer. Here we will be using bitwise SSH client to initiate the connections with the SSH server of the Raspberry Pi, the Raspbian OS. The Raspbian OS is a Debian-based operating system for Raspberry Pi since 2015. It has been officially provided by the Raspberry Pi Foundation as the primary operating system for Raspberry Pi. Though Raspberry Pi can support Windows 10, here we will be using Raspbian OS. PuTTY is a free and open source terminal emulator, serial console and a network file transfer application. It is actually a free SSH and Telnet client. It also supports serial port connections. VNC. The VNC is a graphical desktop sharing system that allows you to remotely connect the desktop interface of one computer from another computer or mobile device. The VNC viewer transmits the keyboard and either mouse or touch events to the VNC server and receives update to the screen in return. Sometimes it is not convenient to work directly on the Raspberry Pi. Maybe we would like to work on it from another device by a remote control. The Raspberry Pi comes with real VNC pre-installed in it. Hence, it is easier for us to access Raspberry Pi remotely. In the next video, we'll see how to connect Raspberry Pi through SSH to our computer remotely and how to view it via our VNC viewer. Thank you.